All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be talking about spark plugs. I know this is one of those age-old topics that everybody's always wanting to discuss. You know, what are the best plugs to run in your car? Now, I, of course, have an opinion on this, and I've talked about it several years ago in my previous spark plug video, but now that we've got some updates and other things to talk about, I thought I would make this updated guide. So any of you that are new to the platform or new to the channel, or just in general, you want to keep up with the latest information for our engines, I can go ahead and share all the information that I have with you guys. The good news is a lot of the old information is exactly the same, but we do have some new information out there. You know, we finally identified a new colder spark plug that can potentially work in your B58 engine. So just a lot of cool options depending on your power goals. So we'll go ahead and talk about that in this video, and hopefully you guys find it useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Now, to start things off, let's talk about some of the basics because, I just want to make sure we get a baseline and everybody's on the same page. The two things that most people are concerned about when they're looking at spark plugs are the heat range and the spark plug gap. So first thing, heat range, this is basically describing the spark plug's capacity to absorb and distribute heat into your cylinder head. When your combustion cycle happens, obviously it creates a lot of heat inside the combustion chamber, and that gets absorbed into the spark plug. So you need one that can basically work with that amount of heat without it getting damaged. If you have a hotter spark plug, then it's not going to handle the heat as well as a colder spark plug. So it's kind of maybe the reverse of what you might think, but typically what people want to do is move to a colder spark plug when they're making more power, because as you add power to your car, it's going to create more boost, more heat, and thus you need a spark plug that can handle that extra heat. So typically colder is better, but it kind of depends on your specific setup. If the spark plug is too hot, then it can potentially crack and damage components and cause engine damage. If it's too cold, then it will have a poor combustion process and can be covered in soot and deposits that you don't really want. So you really want it to be in the correct range so that everything performs well and efficiently regardless of how you're driving your car. The next thing we look at is the spark plug gap, and this describes the gap between the electrode and the strap. This is where that electricity will jump between that gap to create the combustion. So it'll light up the air-fuel mix so that you can have the actual combustion process. This gap is important because if you have a bigger gap, then it will allow a more efficient and effective burn, and just overall it increases your efficiency. However, as you're adding power, that also again increases the heat, increases the pressures in the combustion chamber, and that can prevent the spark from effectively jumping between those two components. So in those cases, you need to reduce the gap so that the spark can still fire. And hopefully you'll notice between these two, they're not really power adders. There's something to compensate for additional power. So what typically happens is if your spark plug gap is too big or your plugs are too hot, you'll experience misfires and have issues that indicate you either need to improve the spark plug gap on your plugs or replace your plugs with the ones that have a colder heat range. So again, a lot of you guys come from older platforms where you need to go to 1 or 2 step colder spark plugs when you tune your car. You need to reduce the gap in your spark plugs. All of that is general knowledge for most cars. However, as you know, the B58 is very different. We have very good spark plugs from the factory, and let's go ahead and talk about what those are. I'll give you guys some part numbers. So for the Gen 1 B58, our OEM part number is 12120040551. And then for B58 TUs, so that's M340i, Supras, all of the Gen 2 cars, your part number is 12122455258. So they do have different spark plugs from the factory. Yes, they are both B58 engines, but there are slightly different dimensions in the different spark plugs that led BMW to specify a different recommendation. Now, the good news is these OEM plugs are simply aftermarket plugs put in BMW packaging. So you can buy direct from the aftermarket companies and purchase them and make sure that you're getting the spark plugs that you want for a cheaper price. The other thing is BMW used multiple suppliers for their spark plugs. Sometimes they use NGK, sometimes they use Champion. And if you order 6 spark plugs directly from BMW, there's a very good chance you're going to get a mixed batch. So you might get 1 or 2 of NGKs and then 4 or 5 of Champions or some different mix. It's very common for them to carry all of them at the same time. And if they just grab them off the shelf, you're not really sure what you get. So with all that in mind, I highly recommend ordering directly from the aftermarket company that makes your spark plugs. So for Gen 1, your options are the NGK 94201 or the Champion 9425. So those are the 2 spark plug options that you could potentially get if you buy that OEM BMW part number. On the Gen 2, the NGK option is 96206. And then the Champion, unfortunately, it looks like it might have been discontinued. Some of you guys might have pulled Champions out of your car, but it seems like they might not be using it anymore. But I'll also include the part number on here. It's a very unique part number, so that way you guys, if you want to order the Champion versions, you can do that as well. Now, both of these plugs are OEM and virtually identical. Obviously, BMW saw enough similarities that they're completely interchangeable from their side of things. And if you look at the specs and all of that, you'll see that they're pretty much the same. I typically go for the Champions on my Gen 1 car. My 440i came with Champion plugs. My 340i came with NGK plugs. So it seems like depending on the model year and when they were making them and stuff, they just came with different plugs, but otherwise they're basically the same. The NGK plugs are at an 8 heat range on the NGK scale, and the Champion plugs are a 4 heat range on the Champion scale, but you will see that both of these scales are different. So as the number on Champion plugs go up, it gets colder, and as the numbers go down on the Champion scale, it gets colder. So you can't really cross-correlate them. There are some charts out there that will show the spark plug heat ranges side by side, and that'll indicate that the Champion plugs are technically slightly colder, but for all intensive purposes, they're basically the same. Also, on the spark plug gap side of things, they are pretty much the same as well. You'll notice that the OEM plugs are usually around 0.028 to 0.031 inches, or around 0.7 to 0.8 millimeters of spark plug gap from the factory. If you do get these plugs, you can always double check just to make sure that the gap hasn't been messed up from shipping and manufacturing, just to make sure that it's in that range. But that's where you should expect it regardless of the plugs that you buy. Now, to go to a colder plug on the NGK, that heat range number should go up, and on the Champion it should go down. And the cool thing is we did identify some colder plugs that you can potentially use in your car if you need it. So I've identified 2 different options that should fit our cars, and they are at a 9 heat range on the NGK scale. The first one is NGK 93560, and this is one actually I've seen people posting about on the forums and stuff. So there are some people running these. And the other one is NGK 91731. I haven't seen anybody running these, but if you look at them on like the NGK comparison, you can see all the specs are pretty much the same. Now, these are OEM Porsche Audi plugs, so it looks like they're designed to fit a couple different versions of the Panamera, the 718. Also, it fits like the Audi S4, so a couple different models from, those German brands. But the good thing is, the dimensions are the same, the thread's the same, the hex is the same, but it's a heat range of 9. So that's a colder plug that you could potentially use in your car if you think that you need to go that route. However, that's a lot of information, so let's really just get down to the specifics of the spark plugs that I recommend for your setup. So first of all, of course, on a stock car, I recommend OEM plugs. So that would be, on a Gen 1, the NGK 94201 or the Champion 9425. So if your car is stock and you're running pump gas, maybe even a couple basic bolt-ons without a tune, then you just should stick with the OEM plugs. The next setup I recommend for a stage 1 car are the stock plugs. So you should go with NGK 94201 or Champion 9425. And then in the case of a TU, you go with the NGK 96206. Now, if you're stage 2, so if you have a downpipe, I recommend the OEM spark plugs. So that is the NGK 94201 or Champion 9425 for Gen 1 cars, and then the NGK 96206 for a Gen 2 B58. Now, for those of us that have Gen 1s, we have the Stage 2 Plus version that allows us to put a high-pressure fuel pump on our car and make even more power with the upgraded fuel system. So if you're running Stage 2 Plus, I recommend the OEM spark plugs. So that's NGK 94201, and Champion 9425. Now, those are just kind of basic pump gas recommendations, but let's say you're running some ethanol. So if you're running E30, I recommend running OEM spark plugs. So that's NGK 94201 and Champion 9425. Or on a TU engine, that's NGK 96206. If you bump that up to E50, then I recommend the OEM spark plugs. That's NGK 94201 or Champion 9425 for Gen 1 and NGK 96206 for Gen 2. Now, if you go all the way up to full E85, that's when things kind of get a little bit dicey. And in that case, I recommend OEM spark plugs. So that's NGK 94201 or Champion 9425 for Gen 1 and NGK 96206 if you have a Gen 2 B58. Now, if you're pushing a big turbo, like in my case, I have a top mount turbo kit. Most of us are pushing 600 to 700 horsepower, so literally doubling the horsepower rating from BMW. In that case, I recommend OEM spark plugs, NGK 94201, Champion 9425 for Gen 1, and NGK 96206 for Gen 2. So hopefully you guys are seeing a trend here. You know, I pretty much recommend the OEM plugs with the stock spark plug gap on most all setups that are out there. It's not too hard to identify if your spark plugs are causing an issue. Typically, after you go past a certain boost level, you'll begin to experience misfires and have issues that you can tell aren't fuel related in your logs. There's no oil being pushed or any PCV issues. At that point, I would begin looking at your ignition system. So these are people pushing extremely high horsepower. I would say probably 800 or 900 plus. At that point, you can potentially gap your spark plugs to increase the longevity of your stock plugs, or potentially you could move to one of those colder spark plugs like the two I recommended from the Porsche Audi catalog. But again, most people are not going to experience these issues. We're seeing Supras pushing even up to over 700 horsepower on the stock plugs and stock gap. So that's really what I recommend to most people, especially if you're coming to me. You probably have a relatively simple build based on your goals. Now, another question I've gotten is, will the TU2 plugs be any better? And unfortunately, we haven't seen any information that indicates they're any different or any better. We have OEM part numbers, but I don't have any way to cross-reference on like NGK or Champion's website to see if they're using the exact same plugs. But it doesn't seem like they'll be any different. You know, the compression numbers are going to be relatively the same. The horsepower numbers we've seen are basically the same. So it doesn't really seem like that's a benefit. The other thing people asked are if we should use S58 plugs, and S58 plugs are currently the same as the Gen 2 plugs. It looks like NGK superseded their old B58 TU2 part number with this new 96206, and this is the same one that you'll see used on the S58 cars. So again, no real benefit there. I recommend Gen 1 cars stick with Gen 1 plugs, and Gen 2 cars stick with Gen 2 plugs. There's no reason to change it. If you do switch from NGK to Champion, just keep an eye on things. New plugs have a tendency to perform better than old plugs. So that doesn't necessarily mean your old plugs were worse or the old brand was, you know, just crappier quality. It could just be that, you know, your old plugs were a little bit more worn and now your new plugs are giving your car a much happier engine. So there's a lot of stuff that works. There's a lot of things that are going to be perfectly fine and not really an issue. If you're doing something different than my recommendation, I'm not telling you to rush out to your garage and change everything now. But if you are planning out, you know, future maintenance and upgrades based on your performance goals, hopefully this gives you a little more insight on what you should do so that you can make sure you have the best luck possible. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.